be about it.
All right, everybody, welcome. Happy National Voter Registration Day. Yay! This is our first event, right? We've only been in school now for just over 2 weeks and it feels like 2.5 years. But anyway, we're glad you're here for our first event. Perfect timing. It's a great day and we appreciate the wonderful turnout, and hello to all the people on Zoom. So I'm Diane Ryan. On behalf of our Dean Dana Cunningham, I would like to welcome all of you here to Tisch College for today's event, our kickoff for our Election 2024 series featuring our visiting fellow, Louisa Terrell. So yay for Louisa, thank you. So we're very excited to have her this semester, where she's going to lead all of our special programming on this, pretty exciting election season. So you can check out all these events that we have or sign up for office hours with Louisa through our Tisch College events page. We'll be adding more events and more opportunities throughout the semester, so make sure you check it often and follow us on social media for all of the updates. So I'm going to keep this very short so we can enjoy more time with our guests today, but please note that we have people on the Zoom, and in this room, the microphones are all in the ceiling. So if you're in the room, please try to limit your sidebar conversations and keep the unnecessary noise down so that the people on Zoom are able to hear every word our guests say today. So if you are a jumbo vote leader here in the room, please raise your hand.
No, they might be tabling outside by Jumbo.
Oh, they're outside.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll skip that part. So the jumbo vote leaders, look out for them. They will be around campus a lot this semester. And those are the people that are going to be able to help you with information about how to register to vote, checking your voting location, applying for your absentee ballot, and so forth. So cheers to our jumbo vote leaders who are ably assisted by our senior coordinator, Daniela Sanchez. And those are the folks that are going to help you with what you need. So Louisa's going to kick us off in a minute with a few slides and welcome our guests. But first I want to introduce you to Louisa, since this is our first time this year with her. She has been a board member in the past and a very active Tisch College alumna. So we're thrilled to have her with us for this semester. So Louisa served as the assistant to the president and director of the White House Office of Legislative Affairs from January 2021 to August of 2023. Where she led teams to successfully pass a suite of historical bipartisan bills to aid veterans, thank you, advance U.S. semiconductor manufacturing, and pass the Inflation Reduction Act. She also provides strategic counsel to nonprofits and businesses. But she's held many positions throughout her long career in government, including serving as advisor to the Federal Communications Commission Chair, Tom Wheeler, and Special Assistant to President Obama in the White House Office of Legislative Affairs, to include many other positions. She currently serves as Senior Advisor to the Harris Campaign and the Democratic National Convention, and she chaired the Democratic National Convention Platform Drafting Committee. And while Louisa does have a distinguished career in Democratic politics, it's also true that she has a longstanding reputation of someone who reaches across the political spectrum and has a prestigious and successful track record of getting things done, even in a very divided Washington, D.C. So it's all the more reason why we're thrilled to have her this semester and for these events that she's leading on campus, including today's talk, because she features guests with ideologically diverse perspectives and backgrounds, which is very important. So I want to thank Roger Lau, Betsy Ankney, and Matt Mowers, who you can see on the Zoom, as today's special guests for joining our conversation. I know you'll all have an opportunity to introduce yourself and share your backgrounds, but we wanted to let you know how much we appreciate you. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank our amazing event staff for putting this all together and feeding us. So with that, I leave you in the very capable and dynamic hands of Louisa Terrell. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and of course, thanks to Tish and the dean and the terrific team here. It is great to be with you guys. Appreciate you spending a little lunchtime hour with us, and I'm just thrilled to be able to start this conversation with students and the community throughout this through the fall. So thank you, and you guys ordered up very lovely weather as well, so I appreciate that. So I'm gonna go through and introduce who you're talking with today. I'm gonna try and we're gonna all sort of walk through these slides, but what I really want is for us to kind of talk together, and then we'll pause, and then it'll be a time for you all to have comments, questions, things that we can follow up on. And then at the end, we'll go through a little bit of some of the practicalities of ways that we see how young people can get involved in the election season, right? Across the aisle in lots of different capacities. So that's the general game plan. But again, our point here is to really make sure that we're talking all together and that you're not being talked at, because we want to hear from you about how we think about this. So what is really, it's a real privilege for me today, because what I get to do is actually give you pros. And I'm gonna first introduce Betsy, and Betsy is here after having served as a campaign manager for Nikki Haley's presidential campaign. She has run campaigns for other federal electeds in Washington, DC, and she is a real veteran and a pro. And we are really thrilled to have that kind of expertise. Roger has also run a campaign for Elizabeth Warren, also someone who's also worked for federal elected officials. Kerry, he's like a Boston guy. So you got a little Richie Neal over here, you got a little John Kerry. Roger knows this stuff. And then I'm really excited too, on the screen is Matt Mowers. Hi, Matt. Who did some service in the administration, particularly in some pieces on our foreign affairs and at the State Department. Also worked and was a senior advisor in some of the Trump-Pence campaign stuff, and has been an advisor and involved in a lot of sort of Republican politics. And most importantly, he doesn't just talk about being about politics, but he is someone who has run and knows how to run his own campaigns in New Hampshire. So again, a terrific voice to join us in this conversation. So, and I am very grateful for the smarts. So here's our agenda that I just ran through. If you can just flip to the next. Here we are in full blown for you guys, in case you forget our names. Here we all are. And then, so what I wanted to do is we sort of go through a list. There is not a perfect combination of what makes a winning presidential campaign. But when we sort of thought about it, these are some of the pieces that we think are really important. And each of these sort of afford us a way to kind of do a deep dive into what is it that really are kind of what we're going to talk a little bit about, the secret sauce. So at the top, really, you see it talking about resources. This is money, right? These are expensive endeavors. And so that a core piece about building blocks of a campaign, presidential, is you really need to be thinking through about this money piece. Communication strategy, right? That is this issue. You need money and you need voters. And when you think about that communication strategy and execution, this is about getting the winning message. Who are you actually talking to? Because you've always got to be thinking about your audience and your voters, and how you're doing, what platform. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but that in particular in this environment is really important. There is this piece too, I'm going to call it infrastructure. And I like this, I like knowing all the different boxes and pieces. And for that, it's just a big endeavor. I mean, you guys see some of this already, but you've got field organizations in your states. You've got to organize, thousands and thousands of volunteers. You've got to bring in campaign leaders. You need to bring in all these battleground state pieces. You've got to figure out how you're tapping into various coalitions, whether it's, Veterans for Louisa for president. Those are pieces that you've got to have that big infrastructure for a winning campaign. I like this part about research and data on voters. Part of this is in this environment, in particular, in a fractured media place, where now we're able to sort of think and aggregate information on voters in a very hyper focused way. So this is about, like, you're testing your ads. Do they work? What are the dials that you're listening to during a debate and how voters are reacting to your debate performance? You've got pollsters that you're hiring, that you're talking to, but there's a big piece that is increasingly important and a fundamental building blocks of campaigns that's really on this research and data piece. Like when I was a very young person doing campaigns, you would literally get a like a sheet of paper that would have a name of a voter. You'd know if they were a registered Republican or a Democrat. You'd have their address if you were door knocking, or you'd have a phone number if you were phoning them. But by and large, what you knew was who's a registered Democrat, who's a registered Republican, and basically where do they live and like how many people live in their house. And that was, I mean, that is like prehistoric time. But the jump from where that was and about how you build data and research on voters to where we are now is a really important piece about how you're building successful campaigns. And then I put on here about persuasion and mobilization. It's up around communications, but think about communications as about your candidate, what he or she is about, who they are, what is their vision. And then this part about persuasion and mobilizing, particularly on National Registration Day, by the way, is really also about how you're figuring out how you're using your infrastructure smartly and getting your voters to not only say that they like you, but they have to figure out how you're getting them and mobilizing them. And then the last piece is about party dynamics. I felt a little uncomfortable about this one in particular, because there's some parts of this in a party that can feel old school. Like, what is a party for anymore? Like, why are we doing this? And the sort of hierarchy of parties. But, and Roger knows a ton about this from some of his perch at the DNC now, but you really do have to understand that a lot of presidential campaigns have connectivity with the party. There's coordinated campaigns, what you're doing, how you're figuring out what you're doing at headquarters. You're trying to infiltrate in Michigan, you're gonna be working with the Michigan Democratic Party. There's ways that in some of the work that Roger and I have done in the past, you're dovetailing all the time with the Democratic National Party on voter protection. What are you doing about misinformation and disinformation? There's ways in which you're doing a lot of work with parties besides understanding who's the Democrat and who's the Republican in your particular district. So I don't think this is perfect. But I think for all of us, we're looking at the sort of big picture of like what's in here that helps you get to a winning presidential campaign. So Roger, Betsy, Matt, anything to add on our mega list? Good.
I think we'll get into it.
Awesome. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Okay. I sound like I'm money obsessed. I'm not money obsessed. I also think there's good conversations and dialogue and debate to be had about the role of money in politics. But let's put a pin in that for a second, because that would take all of our day and our nights, and we couldn't finish our conversation today. But let's assume for a second that we're just thinking about the kind of monies that are required to run a successful presidential campaign. And a lot of it is ads, right? So if you're looking at in the 2020 cycle, you're looking at about $14 billion. I'll tell you that from the Harris campaign perspective, they're probably going to spend about $340 million themselves on advertising between now and Election Day, which is a big, big component of how you're figuring out to communicate. And there's also sort of how you're thinking about these fundraising programs, how you're thinking about getting donors, how you're getting online people. This is just a big part. This is the engine that you need to drive everything else. But I'm going to pause here too, because when I think about again, these guys have actually done it. So we're going to tap into their wisdom. But what I have really noticed about successful presidential campaigns is you have to make a decision in a presidential every day about where you're going to allocate resources. You have to decide sort of where is the dial moving? Where is your dollar going to make the bang for the buck? There's some things you have to reserve far in advance. Okay, you've got advertising that's going to happen on the Super Bowl. You've locked, you've loaded, you know what your expenditure is. But there are pieces all the time in a presidential where you're looking at where you got to invest. If you're betting on a market to a certain extent, right? And so those kinds of decisions have to be done on a daily, weekly basis, but you got to have a pot here of where of how you're doing that. So I guess I want to just turn a little bit to Roger and Betsy in particular. as you were doing it either for Warren's campaign or for Haley's campaign, like, how did you think about this idea of this, how you're investing? When do you make decisions? How important was this as sort of a backbone of driving some of how you were thinking about running a campaign, a presidential?
So your budget is the single most important thing that you have. Your budget is your plan. And it is so often overlooked. I think people want to focus on some of the sort of sexier aspects of campaigns, but the reality is you can't do any of that unless you raise enough money and you spend it efficiently. You are essentially starting a small business from scratch, running it efficiently, and bankrupting it at the exact right time. Like, that's what you are doing.
Yeah.
And so you have to understand what your calendar looks like. Louisa talked about voter registration. You have to understand, when are people voting? How are they voting? If you know that in a particular state that 50% of your voters are going to be voting before October 15th, you need to plan your budget accordingly. So you have to have all of this planning done at the beginning in terms of what the cadence looks like, how you are sort of mapping this out. And then the most fascinating part of a presidential campaign budget is that it is so often feast or famine.
Yeah.
In a Senate race, you can kind of know, like, okay, you're sort of, trekking along, you're gonna raise $20 million, you plan for that. In a presidential primary in particular, I will say on the Haley campaign, like, there were days over the summer when we were just like scratching and clawing for every dollar. The first debate happened and we were ready for that moment. And all of a sudden we raised a ton of money. So your budgeting is so dynamic. And so it's not just about like where you are putting those buckets, but sort of how you are looking at that over time. And so that comes into staffing decisions and not building up too big too soon. That goes into having parameters around your travel in states and how many people are on the road and how big your events are and how much you're spending on them. All kinds of these little things go into that puzzle. And so you have to do all of that before you even really get to the fun stuff, which is like, you're banking your dollars for the most part so that when you get to that point of time when people are paying attention, you have the resources that you need to really reach those voters in a targeted way with the messages that they care about on the mediums that they're paying attention to. So with that, I'll let.
No, I think Betsy covered it in very PTSD forms for me. Thinking about just budgets and fundraising. And, that's the thing. I think she's exactly right. So much of campaigns, unfortunately, has to do with money. And, you need money to talk to voters. You need money to advertise. You need money to run program. You need money to open offices. All the big basic sort of foundational blocks of a campaign. That said, I want to definitely co-sign everything Betsy said. But I worked for Elizabeth Warren during her 2020 campaign. I was her campaign manager. And we started thinking about this in a little bit different way, right? There is the money piece and you have to plan to fund a campaign, but you also have to put together a plan to raise money for a campaign. And there's a whole plan that goes around that. There's huge investment that goes around that. I mean, the amount of money we spend to raise money is insane, right? But think about that sort of conundrum right there, right? And what's even worse, the more dangerous part of it, it's not just the money that you spend to raise money. It's the other, what I would argue is the most important, most valuable resource you have in a campaign is time.
Yeah.
Right? The time that you spend raising money is killer, right? So I would argue, and I think you could probably relate to this too, Betsy, when you start running for president from scratch in a primary, not in a general election, right? In our field in 2020, there were 24 candidates running for president, right? There was an unprecedented field, more senators than ever, more female candidates than ever, more people of color than ever. We had a former vice president. I mean, it was an incredibly talented field. And basically, we thought about, sort of mechanics of a campaign, and we're like, we need to raise money, right? We need to raise money to do this. How do we do that, right? And, when we started thinking about it, it's like, why are we running for president? What are we hoping to do? And as we're thinking about this 24-person field of incredibly talented candidates, it's like our odds of becoming a nominee and winning this thing was at best 10%, right? In a field like that. And I would say that was better than most people, right? And, if we're lucky enough that we get to the general election, then you still have to fight that challenge, right? So we're like, okay, it's not that we're not going to try to win this race, but what are we trying to do in this race, right? And for us, it was, she had this idea that, look, if I'm going to run for president, I might not win, but if I'm going to spend a year doing this thing, a year and a half doing this thing, how do I want to spend that time? Do I want to spend that time traveling around the country? She's based in Massachusetts and Boston, going from Boston to New York to Philadelphia to DC to Miami to Dallas to San Francisco, LA, Chicago, maybe stop in Iowa for campaign stop, go to New Hampshire and talk to some voters, come back here, get a night's sleep, and start that trip all over again just to raise money. And then also in a world where all the other candidates were competing for the same big donors, right? So it wouldn't be like one coffee, one phone call, one event. It would be like all 24 of us courting these donors trying to raise money to fund a campaign. And it was impossible, right? So for her, she was like, I am running to talk about a certain set of issues that I care most deeply about, right? And what if we decide to, take the most valuable resource we have, which is time, and optimize it in a different way, and hopefully go out there, skip all the time that you're spending raising money. Don't use the money that you do raise to raise more money, but instead use that time and money to talk to voters and talk to people about ideas. And hopefully by generating excitement, generating, the third part of a campaign, which is a resource, which is, human capital, volunteers, utilizing that time. Hopefully through talking about ideas and centering around people, we'll raise some money off of it. We didn't win, right? But we did raise $128 million in that primary. And without doing a single fundraiser, asking for a single dollar in a high dollar event. So the money piece is important, being able to raise money for that is important, but there's different ways of doing this, but the point I'm trying to make, right? At the end, we would have raised major dollar money if it was something that made sense for us to do, but in that particular field, it didn't make sense. So we're like, what is the most important thing? Time. How do we optimize that? By not fundraising, right?
Well, and I think to follow up on that, Roger's totally right in that fundraising costs a lot of money, but it's not just the major donor fundraising. Like one of the biggest misnomers, when I teach other campaign schools, people think that digital fundraising is free. It is not. It is one of the most expensive ways to raise money. And to what Louisa said, you really are making bets. Like, you raised an enormous amount of money online. We didn't until that first debate. And like we, placed a bet on that and said, okay, we are going to invest in, a lot of list rentals and a lot of search ads and a lot of sort of digital infrastructure so that we can capitalize on those moments.
And then
Ultimately,
content
it
you
paid
have to trade
off.
for that.
Yeah.
Totally. And ultimately it pays off, but it is incredibly expensive. But I mean, like as any candidate will tell you, and Matt can tell you, like, like Nikki would love when we would raise a ton of money online, because she's like, I didn't even do anything. And ask anybody.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's an interesting.
No, it's interesting.
Louisa, can I just add one thing on there?
Please.
And they touched on basically all the great points, including, just the amount of investment to build and creating the infrastructure to capitalize on those small dollar donor moments. But I think because of the growth in small dollar fundraising, just the importance it has, it really does marry up your fundraising operation with your messaging and your earned media operation, probably more than it would have certainly a generation ago. I mean, instead of just being a big state governor, you can go down to Austin, get everyone in Austin to give you a check, and then fly off to Iowa and spend the money. To Betsy's point, it really is about capitalizing on those moments. And you'll see on campaigns, especially presidential races these days, if you are tracking when you're seeing a surge in donations, it's very often, even besides the big debate nights, it's when your candidate's doing a Sunday show, or they're maybe doing a primetime TV show and they're giving a shout out to their website, and you actually see the uptick in donations. And so more and more you are seeing an intertwining there. And when you wonder why are candidates going on and doing a bunch of earned, cable TV hits, yes, it's to get their message to voters, but most importantly, it's because they're trying to get donors. And if you remember this last cycle, the RNC actually put in benchmarks that candidates had hit on small dollar donors that they needed and the number of donors they needed to qualify for the debate. And so entire campaign strategies that traditionally would have been built around how do we have enough money and enough donors to actually go and win votes, are instead actually shifting the nature of the race to how do we get enough donors to just participate on the debate stage so we can get that next big moment. And it really shifts the way you have to plan and kind of build the infrastructure for these things.
Yeah, no, it's a really great point. And look, I don't start this with you all, like, here's like the dirty underside of politics. And this isn't necessarily like But I just wanted you all to just see this piece. And I do think, like to Roger's point, there is some thinking and advocacy that we can think about that is going to change some of these dynamics. So and I think that's really important. So I'm not trying to get us into like the less fun parts of campaigns, but I do think Betsy's point about it's just sometimes not self-evident of like all that this entails, right? We sort of get big donor receptions, but it is this other piece. I just wanted you guys to sort of see that and understand how and it's critical, like even with the way that Roger did it with Warren's campaign, it is hard to do still in this environment. So, but let's go on to something a little bit more cheery, other than just the money in politics. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, this is the juicy stuff. And Matt is the perfect segue into this. So part of this is, in this moment that we're in, is we have to reach a lot of voters who, unlike Betsy, Roger, Matt, and I, who do not think about politics 24/7. And we can talk about sort of what some of the challenges there. But more and more, this is really about thinking about how a presidential campaign is communicating. And you have a kind of a window here, right? And when we say earned media, we're saying like freebies. Roger's doing a press conference and a bunch of reporters show up. We call that's earned media because he didn't have to pay for it. Betsy has paid media. She shoots an ad. It's on paid media stuff. Those are some ways that people are communicating, but there's a whole host of other things. But really, this is less about the what, less about how, and more about the what. And really looking in presidentials, how important it is to really introduce and define your candidate before the opponent does. It's much easier to help someone form an opinion about Louisa as opposed to having you change your mind about Louisa. So that's part of that big imperative when you're in presidentials, to really be thinking about how you're introducing and defining the candidate rather than having people change their mind. Clearly, we are in a contrast message has to be part of this, right? You're thinking about why would you pick between Betsy and Louisa? You're figuring out where they stand. Some of that's old school, how we say like, what do we think about an issue? But you really have to have a underlying contrast message. And that also has to do with like a crowded media space and how do you kind of break through in that environment? And then, a lot of this too sort of goes back to how do you reach in and talk about something that matters to people's lives, right? And really and truly, like that is really about like, Roger comes in office and here is how he's going to impact your life tomorrow. Sort of going through your list of accomplishments when Roger's a fancy senator from Massachusetts, that's great. But remember, in presidentials, oftentimes you're using accomplishments as a data point as to why you can believe my word. If I'm promising you what I'm going to do for you tomorrow, I look back at my accomplishments and say, you may like my infrastructure bill or not, but I'm demonstrating that I'm good for it. But we sort of sometimes think that presidential sometimes can rely on accomplishments in of themselves. They are simply proof points to help you have trust and credibility with the voter about the promise you're going to make for tomorrow. Okay, I love the word fractured media landscape. It's probably like now I've overused it for this entire year. And maybe it's also because I'm not really entirely sure how TikTok works. So it's sort of it's manifesting there. But I really think this presidential campaign that we're living in right now is sort of the first one in some ways that's really grappling how to be smart in a very fractured media landscape. Two pieces, right? When Biden ran in 2020, you had sort of COVID craziness, right? And there was some ways there that were unusual about how you try and win. But where we are now about how people are just consuming content, and I use the word content loosely, whether you're talking about an ad, it's all over the map. And so really what presidential campaigns have to do is to be hyper targeted. I want to reach, you sort of say what your demographic is and you look and like, okay, I'm going to do WhatsApp advertising. I'm going to definitely target a certain kind of voter sort of just on Spotify. And how you're thinking of streaming TV is a huge piece of that. And the other thing you have to grapple with, when I talked about earned media and paid media, we're in an environment, and I know we feel it like in the business sometimes of just kind of cynicism, distrust, not feeling like politics works. They're all kind of bums. And so in that environment, the messenger has to be someone that you know, or that you are connected with and have connection with and trust. So that is an imperative when you think about a communication strategy, who your messenger is. It used to be like Betsy would stand up and give her pitch and you listen, and that could be compelling. Now it actually needs to be like your cousin, your roommate, a person that you're seeing somehow vouching. And the way that they're doing a lot of that, expressing their support for Betsy or for Roger, is through organic online pieces in particular. But we're in an environment where this piece of like who voters really go to whom they know is a different kind of environment when we see dial moving in where voters get to trust. So and then I want to go back to one other thing that Matt made a really good point. In all this communication piece, and particularly in a fractured media market, you've heard the expressions like, how do things break through? But this importance of a viral moment, like you guys live it in your lives all the time, right? You're like sharing and identifying viral moments for a whole host of things. I can't overstate how in a presidential campaign, you are literally on the hunt for a viral moment every day. You're designing a calendar in a way that your principals are on the road in a presidential to think about how can you add some sauce to what's going on the field, whatever they're doing on that schedule, so that you're heightening the moments that could be viral. You don't know, that's the whole point, like they are somewhat spontaneous, but there are things you're sprinkling in to the daily calendar of what your principals are doing when you're 50 days out. 50 days out is a crash. You've got to make sure that you are picking out ways to that viral moment to get to what Matt said, which is like, that's organic special stuff that they need to break through here. So with that, I want to go back to Matt, if I could, a little bit in talking about this comm strategy and how you thought about it. Like, even from your own perspective, Matt, having been a candidate, and then when you look at presidential elections, what do you think about this? Is the viral moment piece, we've talked about it for fundraising, but for getting votes, like how did you either build it in, or how have you seen it either change and have impact in presidentials?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. I mean, you've got obviously certain tent poles throughout the campaign where all eyes are going to be on the race, right? Big debate moments obviously sets up well to kind of have one of those opportunities. Often the viral moments are not the ones you have planned, right? It's sometimes in fact the candidates that go in trying to get that zinger in, it comes across kind of cringy and kind of contrived, and so often it's when Nikki Haley rips Vivek's head off in the first debate, where I don't think, like, she probably assumed there was a chance that would happen, but didn't know it would unfold the way it did. So you can't always plan for it. And then the other moments are the ones on the campaign trail. And that's where it's important for the campaign to really know the candidate well. What is the environment? What is the type of event where they thrive? If it is a business person who's all buttoned up and stiff, and you throw them into a town hall meeting where anyone can ask any question, it's not going to give them the opportunity to showcase their best attributes. It's not going to be where they're the most comfortable, and you're probably not going to get any moments out of it. And similarly, taking some of these really emotional type of candidates, I mean that in a good way, folks who have a lot of passion and compassion, who are able to connect with people, you're better off keeping them surrounded by voters. And so in the case of, Chris Christie is a good friend. He was constantly going into town hall meetings because that is just a venue where he thrived. He did better in long form than he ever did in scripted short form. And his ability to actually be seen as more than just a political candidate came alive much more in that type of setting. I picked on Vivek a little bit, but he even had a couple moments this race. And if you remember before the first debate, and he kind of decided he wanted to become mini Trump and try to impersonate Trump. But before that, he was getting actually a run of good press, even for, especially from Fox News and things like that, because he did have these moments with liberal voters on whether it's the Iowa State Fair or whether it's at town hall meetings in New Hampshire, where he would invite them in and kind of have this dialogue and this conversation and showed, okay, this is what a kind of MAGA-ish candidate can do if they're willing to actually engage with the other side. He had, I think, really, one that caught a lot of attention going to that first debate was I think he engaged with an LGBT activist in Iowa and actually took the time to listen to her and engage with her in a thoughtful conversation. And what was interesting is, traditionally we think of those moments as like the moment someone gets someone else. And this was one of those viral moments because of, I think, where our politics are right now, where a candidate actually listening to someone else went a little bit viral and got some attention.
Mhm.
So you just want to find those really good kind of atmospheres for each candidate that plays to their strengths.
Yeah, yeah.
What else would you add on this sort of big, either comms piece, Betsy or Roger?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to piggyback on the viral piece of, going back to Senator Warren's campaign, because we didn't have a traditional fundraising model, right? We pledged publicly not to do events. We pledged publicly not to do fundraising, do call time. We had to manufacture those moments every single day for the campaign. And a lot of it was, sort of built-in conflict that Matt was talking about, that, looking for opportunities in debates and engagement to be able to have conflict, because that's what people watch. But then the other piece of it is, for those who are paying attention, Senator Warren was a candidate that was known for having plans, right? And at first people were like, oh, who wants a candidate who has plans? I want to see someone that's like exciting and giving speeches and rallies. But part of it for us was using these plans to create energy, create sort of mini viral moments so that people would engage in a different way. So like, the plan piece of it was like a tentpole of our fundraising operation in a big way, so.
Yeah. I think I agree with everything. I agree with everything these guys said. But I do think it's interesting to note that in this environment, you are almost rewarded. You are rewarded for wild behavior. You are rewarded for bad behavior. It's like if you are watching, a congressional hearing,
Mhm.
the member who is asking, pointed, sober questions to get to the bottom of an issue, they don't get any credit. The member who stands up and is grandstanding and yelling and sort of waving their arms, they get attention. That is what's played on the news, whether it's the right or the left. It's used for fundraising, it's used to create momentum. So it is difficult to try to break through as a candidate who is not sort of one to do those things, not one to sort of be wild and outlandish. And so you have to find those moments, and you have to put your candidate in situations and in instances where he or she can shine. I totally agree with what Matt said in terms of figuring out sort of the best format and venue for your candidate. All candidates are different. All campaigns are different, and you've got to figure out what works best. For Nikki, if you recall after New Hampshire, Nikki went on SNL and kind of poked fun at herself a little bit. She called on Trump to debate. We got a ton of press out of that. And she is probably one of a handful of candidates who could do that and do it, without being really awkward, to be honest. So I think particularly now and, in the presidential primary, obviously Biden was the incumbent president. Trump sucks up a lot of oxygen. Like him or not, Trump is the single biggest defining force in our politics. And so trying to break through that in a primary is incredibly difficult. And so it is about finding those moments, putting your candidate in situations where he or she can shine and capturing it. I mentioned, the team on the road and sort of being mindful of what that is. Even when we had no money, there was always a videographer on the road with Nikki. You have to be in a position where you as a campaign can capture those moments. And that's just the norm these days.
Yeah. And it's interesting now to see, to your point about, sort of how Biden, because he was sitting president, how the communications and the organic moments online, and then the switch to seeing, even though Vice President Harris obviously still occupies that position, there's just sort of a whole different, again, where she's comfortable shows up in a very different way that in the communication strategy campaigns using. Yeah, it's
I
great.
do want to flag one thing though, because I think that we can all get sucked into believing that what we see online is real and what we see on Twitter is real and moments are blowing up. And it's a critical piece of the puzzle. It's what drives news narratives. Like voters aren't on Twitter, voters aren't on X, but reporters are. And so they're picking things up and pushing that out. And so it's an interesting dynamic from a campaign perspective, and it's continuing to shift where you have to be hyper mindful of what is happening online, what's catching fire, what's picking up steam, while also recognizing that most of your voters are not paying attention to that like day-to-day drama that's playing out.
Yeah, the sort of Twitter is not real life. And it was and part of that was a big driver, particularly during Biden's run in 2020. Yeah. All right, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna cover one thing quick, and then maybe we'll pause for a second and allow folks, if you have questions or thoughts or things you wanna talk about, and then kind of go from there, just because you're being very patient. So, all right, can I have the next slide, please? Okay. I just wanted to give you guys a sense, like this is, and again, Betsy and Roger I'm sure there are things missing, but what I wanted to do here is like, I just wanted you to see the business of what this is. So we all took a road trip right now and we went to lovely Wilmington, Delaware, and we went up in there. It takes place over in 3 different buildings about all these different components that make up a successful campaign, right? And you've got your HR, the finance, the policy, the battleground states, where you're doing data, how you're organizing surrogates, right? People on the ground for you, all these key allies, like stakeholder stuff, coalitions, and then even not only like advance and like all the stuff you're doing to actually do the on the ground stuff that these guys have just been talking about. And part of the reason that I like looking at this list, and Roger and Betsy and I were talking about this, and particularly for me, who kind of comes on the other side of the official side of politics mostly, right? About working in the Senate or working in various White Houses. I like things like clean. I like them orderly. I like to know that one goes to the other, goes to the other. Campaigns, they're like messy. They're like super messy. And they're supposed to be messy because they have to change every day. It is a crazy thing that I am on emails every day now at the Harris campaign, and probably in every response during my day, adding in a new person. They just started, they're doing X, like literally, right? It's an organic thing that is moving. It's like an amoeba. And you are figuring out, again, Betsy said it perfectly. You're scaling up to bankrupt yourself. That same mindset is about how you build up here. And what we were doing on the Harris campaign when it was the Harris campaign in July versus what we were doing on the campaign when it was the Biden campaign, even 4 months before that, it's like it's totally different. So I sort of put that out there and we were talking about it, but just to sort of understand that's what the hallways look like, but you really have to get used to this texture of it. That is, you're making choices all the time about where you need people. And I will say too, Betsy raised a really good point about sort of this voter, I'm going to say like misinformation, disinformation, sort of AI, voter integrity, access issues. That should be on, I neglected, I should have put that on the list. But that whole piece is also another huge part of like, and that kicks in a little bit later in the campaign. So that's like now, and that's part of the stuff we do with Roger over at the DNC, but that is a big part. So I'm going to pause there on my messiness. I wonder if any of my esteemed guests have anything to add on that part.
The one thing I will just say, campaigns are messy, but you have to control what you can control. And again, as you are looking at your budget and your plan from the beginning, you have to build to scale. Like, yes, there are always new people coming in, but if you do not have a clear structure and a clear process and a clear system in place, it will crumble. And you see so many campaigns implode from within. You see leaks, you see drama, you see all kinds of nonsense. It is big, it is messy, it is unwieldy. Sometimes you feel like you are like holding this thing together with Band-Aids and duct tape and, a whole lot of willpower. But like, if you are on a campaign, if you are running a campaign, it is so important that you figure out what your structure is, what your process is, Is there a daily meeting every morning at 8 a.m.? Like whatever that is, have a standard operating procedures document so that everyone knows when someone new comes on board.
Yeah, what do they do?
They know like, what is the process for getting out a tweet? What is the process for getting out a press release? What is the process for the schedule? Like control what you can control because it can get insane. And you have to like embrace that, but also keep it together.
Clearly, I should have worked for Betsy. Like, you can tell that we're very simpatico because, but you know, that is absolutely correct, right? It is a real balance between like, holding on to the messiness and then a little bit of an iron hand, which I know that Roger and I have experienced.
Yeah, I was a little bit on the opposite side, but people often ask me, what's the biggest mistake I ever made in running a campaign? And I'm ashamed to admit this, and part of it's, campaigns have luckily gotten a lot more professionalized. It is still chaotic, but, luckily people like Betsy have come in to help professionalize a little bit more. But we started the campaign with probably 200 people, right? And we scaled up to, at the end of it, 1,400 people over 31 states. We had one HR person dealing with all 1,400 people.
Oh my gosh,
That wasn't one of those
that is
things
not
where
true.
I didn't realize what a problem it was until like a week before before we dropped out. It's like, oh boy, we're not gonna make this thing. But it's so important to think about that scaling, and a lot of it is, making sure you have the staff structure in place to be able to scale. They talk about the operations sort of advantage that people have, being able to have people open offices, have people insured, having people paid in time. That's so important. And the funny thing is when people think about campaigns now, yes, we have the organizing people. Yes, we have the comms people. Yes, we have the finance people. But some of the largest departments at the DNC right now are our data people, our research people, and our operations people. So it's a little bit different than it used to be. It's not just people who are making phone calls and knocking on doors.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Matt.
I'll just quickly say, I know this is supposed to be a course in the right lessons of how to organize a campaign, but as someone who was part of the Trump general election in 2016, I can tell you the opposite end of that spectrum too, real quick. I was hired 2 weeks before he accepted the nomination. I did Governor Christie's campaign, the primary, and then was asked to join the Trump campaign about 2 weeks before the convention in 2016. And as national field director, and I remember going in, I literally took the job on a Friday, flew to Cleveland on a Sunday, where the convention was. And they said, one of the challenges we have is there's a lot of legacy staff from different states. He had that long drawn out nomination fight against Ted Cruz. So there's contractors in Alabama and staff in Kansas and, some staff in New York, all sorts of things. And I said, okay, well, that's easy enough. Just, get me the staff list and we'll figure out a way to optimize this. And they said, that's the first thing you've got to work on. I said, what do you mean? They said, we don't have a staff list. We had so many changes in campaign leadership at that point, between Lewandowski to Manafort to then later Kellyanne and Steve Bannon, that literally no one knew at one point who was working for the campaign. And he was the nominee essentially at that point. So it just reminds me of something one person on that campaign said. They said, we've been on some very organized campaigns, but we had no energy. So it was very easy to organize when no one wanted to be part of it. And then we saw the opposite of that, which was kind of Trump 16. I imagine some other more movement type oriented campaigns where you've got to build the infrastructure to keep up with the energy on the ground. And that's a separate challenge.
No, it's a great point. I mean, we're seeing that on the Harris campaign already, right? You have 700,000 volunteers. You got to do something with 700,000 volunteers, right? And this part of it is how you're getting into it. Okay, so we're going to go to the next slide. And then, so this was sort of our secret sauce, some of the things we talked about. And then I'm going to stop and then hear from you guys. I think we talked about the resources because you can't run out of money. We haven't really talked about the map. I love the map, so we can talk about that if you guys have thoughts on that. One of the things that we were talking about before, and I'm going to put out two questions and then I promise we'll stop for a sec, is this idea of like, what is a winning message? And what is a winning candidate? Because in some ways, some political people will tell you that really at the end of the day, a winning message is a message of change. That ultimately that voters want, irrespective of party, is to throw the bums out and that they want a challenger. we are in a world in which we want someone new. So how people message, how they are an agent of change, is that sort of now become the winning message. And then when we were talking about winning candidate, I was telling these guys when I was, I couldn't remember what the timing was. Maybe I was still in the White House or I just left the Biden White House and I was reading this article. I'm gonna totally confess here, I love the New Yorker. I read it every week. I know. But there was a really long New Yorker article about Ron DeSantis. And I was like, this guy could really clean our clock. Like great on paper, got all this experience. He's like got this sort of secret little sweet spot to kind of like push Trump out of the way and but still capture some of the pieces. I just thought it was sort of like, okay, this is interesting. We need to be really careful. Then I think he gets out on the trail and, you know, there may have been some challenges he had as a retail politician. And so it was a reminder to me that you can have you can be really great on paper, but like there's a winning candidate kind of piece of connection and authenticity that sometimes is doesn't necessarily, you just show up differently on paper. But this is, so I'm gonna ask my commentators to say what's missing, what do they disagree about this, and then why don't we pause there? Does that sound good? Okay.
Yeah, no, I think these are all, you know, the big points that we have to hit. But the only other thing I would add is that based on our democracy and the way we elect presidents, you have to get through a primary to get to the general election, right? And I think because of how sort of polarized our politics are right now, you know, between Democrat and Republican, you know, in the primaries that we have, the winning message in a primary, it may not be the best message that gets you into the general election. So it has to be both halves. So you have to take that first step and then the second step. And I think the beauty of the Biden campaign, they ran in 2020, you know, Biden, you know, came out, ran in this primary, again, this large field of candidates who represented a broad range of ideas in the Democratic primary in 20, and talked about restoring the soul of the nation, right? And it was one of those things where, you know, if that wound up becoming a very effective message in the primary where people, you know, who wanted to make sure Democrats were all frightened, they want to make sure that we're beating Donald Trump, we win this election. That was the most important thing, regardless of where they were in the spectrum of the party, they wanted to beat Donald Trump. And I think that helped carry Joe Biden through that primary. But I think once you get to the general election, it reinforced the idea that Donald Trump was creating an agent of chaos, was, you know, was a president that, you know, people felt were just unreliable in different ways. And Joe Biden was going to help restore some, you know, sense of decorum and calm within this country. But it doesn't always line that.
I was gonna say, that's an unusual situation where
Yeah.
nothing that helped you in a primary carries you in an election, but it's a good example
Yeah.
of the anomaly there.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree, and primaries are fickle beasts. And look, I mean, you know, we talked about national voter registration. A very small percentage of people vote, even in a presidential primary. Like, you know,
Especially-
primary, it's like 14%. Like that is a tiny sliver of the electorate who's determining who the nominee is. And I agree. I mean, look, if Nikki Haley was the nominee right now, like I think we'd be having a very different conversation in the general election. But she didn't win the primary. Trump won the primary. So I think that, you know, it's changed, but I think that authenticity is far and away the most important thing that people are looking for. And I think that, you know, when you look at Donald Trump as a perfect example, like, he's messy, there's chaos, like you can think what you want of him from a policy perspective, from a personal perspective. But he's got that factor that people sort of glom onto. Like they just are sort of, you know, like moths to a flame almost. Like people really are fascinated by him, they follow him, they believe him, whether he's right or wrong. And so I think that he's sort of changed the dynamics in a lot of ways. And I think about, you know, a campaign I ran in 2016 with Senator Ron Johnson in Wisconsin, which was an uphill battle. It was a very tough race. And Ron, you know, you may have followed him or not, he says some wild things sometimes, but like he is so authentic and so true to himself, and he firmly believes it. And he is like, I am gonna do what I believe is right for the people of Wisconsin. I don't care what people say about me. And he just has this, you know, I won't swear in here, but this like, you know, like zero F's attitude that people like. And so I think that no matter how that manifests, I think it's important. And I think in our primary, you know, like Nikki Haley is someone who does connect with voters. When she's at an event, she stays until the last person leaves and shakes every single hand. Ron DeSantis doesn't have that quality.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think that combined with, again, he ran out of money, like talking about, you know, they spent more on private planes than they did on talking to voters, like those things all matter. So I don't think there's a perfect formula.
No, there was, right.
Yeah, but like making sure that you run an efficient operation and have the resources to win and having that authentic factor, no matter what specifically your message is.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I would argue too, I think part of the enthusiasm for Vice President Harris too, right now on the ground, right, is there are some ways in which the way that she's interacting is authentic and they're finding places for her to do that in that specific. Okay, you guys have been very patient. Questions, comments, things we've got wrong, things that we haven't raised that you think we should? Hi.
I know, like, when you're talking about candidates, I think inherently they attract certain types of voters. Obviously, in 2020, Biden had this sort of used his background as like white working class from Pennsylvania to attract like white working class voters, and he was able to win those 3 Rust Belt states that usually are recently and now are what decides an election. And obviously Kamala Harris does not have like that sort of same background. So recently she's visited Western Pennsylvania more in the past 6 weeks than Biden did in 6 months. So I'm just wondering how a candidate based on maybe their identity or their platform, how they're able to like strengthen their weaknesses in certain demographics, but also make sure that the people that they can rely on, like their core base, is also like turning out to vote as well.
Wow, such a good question. I'm gonna say 2 things at the top and then I'll invite you guys and Matt to come in. I think you are right on the money and it's actually the perfect segue from what Betsy's saying, because you have to tell a story about who you are and who connects to that immediately and who needs work to get connected to your story. So if you look at what the vice president had to do in a very unusual truncated time, she used her convention and she thought about how she was gonna do that. She knew in some ways, like her middle class roots, her idea that she had to work to McDonald's, that's a very important part of why she's putting that into her narrative. Because she wants people to understand, like she's trying to think about an opportunity economy, a new way forward, an economy where you don't just, you're able to get ahead and not just get by. She needed that kind of middle class roots she makes mention, right, of her mother was a renter for a long time. She didn't get a house until she was in high school. So there are pieces about that she does that. Then she also looks at her prosecutor. She looks at she doesn't talk about her time as a vice president. She talks about being a prosecutor in California. And that's sort of the chops and the way that she sort of, that's who I am. She can take a few clips from when she was, interrogating Brett Kavanaugh, some of my favorite clips of all time, I should say, and say that prosecutor is sort of like that fundamental piece. And she doesn't really talk about California much more out of that, right? Because there's sort of like, are you a California liberal is going to take over the world? And she's really actually a communist. So there's that. So part of it is making sure that's not being seeded into this, but it's really about picking out those very specific things. Now I think for her too, the demographics are really interesting, right? So part of this is reinvigorating the base of the Democratic Party. Big backbone of the Democratic Party is Black women and Black voters in general. So how is she utilizing that sort of background to do that? Obviously, like her AAPI heritage, using that. She's using women, but she's also she's doing a very careful balance of how she talks about those and uses those on the trail. And your point about having to go out, particularly in places like, let's say in Wisconsin, I think it's not as much in other blue belts in terms of Michigan, but how she's going to connect to the center on that is an interesting one. And like, it's an important pathway for her to have to do that to win, I think. Roger, what'd you add with that?
Totally agree. I mean, people talk about, you're talking about Joe Biden winning that blue belt and being that middle class sweater Joe.
Yeah.
I mean, the guy got 81 million votes, right? More votes than anyone's ever gotten in history. Then the person who got the second most ever was Donald Trump, right? So what we know is turnout was incredibly high on both sides of that 2020 election. part of that was, yes, we won because we won over some of those swing voters or gotten enough of those swing voters. But a lot of it was also both candidates, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, were able to go back to their bases, appeal to them and get them to turn out, right? Like, one of the things that, when we think about campaigns, we always think, okay, we build a campaign, we build our resources, we build, how we spend our time based on, who we think is gonna turn out to vote in every election, right? And a lot of times the way we determine that is like looking at who's voted in the past, right? That's like kind of a mistake, right? The best campaigns are the campaigns that are more aspirational about who we think is gonna vote. And as a result of that aspiration, going out and actually engaging with people and getting that base to be bigger, right? So the more younger people that we can get to vote on our side, it's gonna be to our advantage. So, but in order to win these elections, we need that sort of base to turn out and be that intensity of support to be at a high level so people will show up to rallies, volunteer, knock on doors, make phone calls, chip in $5 like every single month, to help, pay for the campaign. But the other part of it is too, that you have that narrow slice of sort of undecided voter that's in these, battleground states, making sure that you're working with them at the margins to, sort of tip in one way or the other. But it's both sides that have to be, in place.
Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, thank you all so much. This is really interesting. Along those lines, I'm wondering what the kind of campaign response or strategy is about the uncommitted movement and the group of people who are deciding not to vote specifically for Harris, mostly along the Palestine lines. I'm wondering if that's something that, is considered, or if you're more focused on the people who aren't sure, undecided, just where that lies in the campaign strategy.
So we'll go, Roger's, we've been working on this for a while in the campaign and also at the convention. So I'm gonna say two things at the top. Put uncommitted in one place and undecided in another. Generally, where the electorate is right now for people who have voted in the past, our undecideds are pretty small. It's a small percentage, right? On uncommitted, I think that's a very different question, right? So this is really about how we've been talking about the war in Gaza and really about an engagement strategy. An engagement strategy kind of sounds kind of cold and not intimate. I don't think that's not what it is. I think there's been conversations and have to have a back and forth with that group. Part of it's been big in Michigan, a little bit in Wisconsin, Washington State. Roger, I'm trying to think if there's other locations where that's been particularly in Georgia. And so I think as a campaign, you're thinking about it all the time, both in terms of how we're engaging and what does it mean to bring those voters, if we can, back into the Harris coalition. I think we're thinking about it in terms of making sure that when we're going places, they're part of the conversation and that doesn't feel oppositional in some ways, like we're negotiating a way in which a principal is going to, say, Michigan, how you're dealing with that. And I think then on the substance, what is Vice President Harris sort of saying about this issue, what she would do, how she thinks about it? And so you also have those decisions that you're making with them. So I kind of put it in those buckets about how the campaign is thinking about it. What am I missing, Roger? I was kind of thinking of some of the conversations, obviously, that we had. The uncommitted piece was a big part of it as we were planning the Democratic convention too.
Yeah, it's critically important. And as Louisa said, the campaign and the party has spent a lot of time engaging with uncommitted delegates and other folks who are sort of unsure about this election because of the conflict in Israel and Gaza. But I think it comes down to, obviously, there's what we need to do, to make sure that we have credible leadership in our government. But the other part of it is, as you mentioned, we're in the context of an election, right? All these battleground states, the 7 battleground states, plus that extra congressional district in Nebraska, they're all within a margin of error, right? In 2020, I think the margin was no more than 2% in each one of these states, with Biden winning some and Donald Trump winning others. And I think it'll be the same this time around. So every single bit of this electorate, whether we're talking about our base that's coming out to vote or these swing voters, they can make the big difference here. And, I think for a lot of people who care about these issues, they're not just Arab and they're not just Muslims, they're not just Palestinians. It's people from across the spectrum, at least on the Democratic side, who care about what's going on their planet. It's young people, it's progressives. So it's something that we think about a lot, especially, through the lens of the math for the electoral map and winning this election. But the other piece of it is also just, I think the vice president does care deeply. I think she has talked about, obviously, with empathy of the sort of death toll that's happened over there, and one would be thoughtful about this as she's talking to these activists. But I think the ultimately, I think one thing to think about is, obviously, this is a free country where people can vote third party, they can vote uncommitted, they can blanket, they can write in a candidate. But the reality is, based on the way our electoral system is structured with the electoral college, it's gonna be a binary choice of, Donald Trump on one hand or Kamala Harris on the other. And I think that, people should vote their values and understand, where the candidates are on each one of these issues. But there's no question that, it's gonna be a vote at the end of the day for one, for the other president. And, hopefully, I think people, use this opportunity through a campaign to raise issues, whether it be foreign policy, domestic issues, the economy, to drive a conversation so that when your candidate hopefully wins, or even if your candidate doesn't win, you can continue that conversation.
the next stage of it.
Once we have
Yeah.
a president, that can govern.
Yeah, I will say, just to add to that, talking about a viral moment, I believe it was at a rally in Michigan when there were protesters and Kamala Harris did her, I'm speaking thing, but she was like, what did she say? She was like, you can keep doing that if you want Donald Trump, but otherwise I'm speaking. And frankly, like, that is like, that, I thought she sort of boiled it down pretty appropriately.
First off, thank you all for your time. I wanted to ask specifically in regards to the Haley and Warren campaigns, how kind of the campaign calculus kind of changes when you reach that point in the election where it's pretty clear that your candidate is not going to win. So then do you kind of retailer the purpose of the campaign to just kind of introduce your candidate on a national stage or maybe advocate for a particular issue? Or is it always like full balls to the wall, let's go win this thing?
So that's a great question. So it was interesting for us on the Haley campaign, like there, if you recall, after South Carolina in particular, there were calls for Nikki to drop out after Iowa. Like there were calls for Nikki to drop out in September, right? Like there was this sort of, like Trump and his team did a good job of sort of consolidating support and momentum. Between Iowa and New Hampshire, they rolled out a whole slew of congressional endorsements, like they, again, thinking about sort of their overall plan, map things out very well to continue that momentum. For us, before South Carolina even voted, Nikki gave a speech saying, regardless of what happens, I am not going anywhere. And this is why, like, this is what I'm fighting for. This is why it's important. We've only had, a couple 100,000 people vote at this point. It is important for more people to have their voices be heard. And this is what I'm fighting for. And so after South Carolina, that call for her to get out was even more deafening. But that Super Tuesday swing that we did, I believe I wrote a memo.
I was gonna say, I remember Betsy.
It was like, we know the odds, but we know the stakes.
Yeah.
I'm like getting chills, a little PTSD. And so we very much looked at it like, we knew that we were fighting an uphill battle. We knew that the odds were against us. We knew that Trump was very likely to be the Republican nominee. But we felt that there were real issues that Nikki wanted to raise. There were real fractures in the Republican Party that she wanted to speak to. And she also felt very strongly that, and polling, backed it up, that she was the strongest candidate in the general election. And if Republicans wanted to get back to winning up and down the ballot, we needed to do something different. And so that Super Tuesday swing was, challenging and difficult for a lot of reasons, but it was also so much fun and so gratifying. And instead of seeing like a waning of support, like people rallied, like we had big events, they were fun, people were fired up. That is when actually, and I didn't even know that this was a thing, but, and Elizabeth Warren had this too, I think, the Taylor Swift friendship bracelets. And like these little girls would come to Nikki Haley events and like give Nikki, homemade friendship bracelets. Like there were so many things that happened in that period of time that were, like had an impact on the race. Nikki very much was like, why are Republicans not talking about fiscal responsibility? Why are Republicans retreating into isolationism? Why are Republicans continuing to lose races when most Americans agree with us on most of our values? And sort of made that case in these states. And so it was not like what with us, like we know.
Yeah, like
things
when
are going well.
the inventory starting to go down,
But
the
it
store's
was-
about to,
It
what
was
I mean?
very much like a, like
liberating in some ways.
Yeah.
Like, I do think that.
Yeah,
I
like
feel
it was
that.
very much like, we get that,
Mhm.
Yeah.
that this is likely to not go our way, but we also know what we're fighting for. We believe in Nikki Haley and we are gonna keep running through that brick wall until
The very end.
the very end. And it was, it was incredibly hard, but incredibly fun and like some of the most rewarding things that we had, so.
But I would also say to that in some ways, like what Betsy describes is you kind of want that in a winning campaign. You don't want to be like barreling towards the brick wall or not have your money. I'm not saying, but there's a moment where real presidential campaigns catch fire and kind of can do this when they're a little bit free and kind of like know where they're going and kind of can feel that, like you kind of know the difference between a constrained presidential in some ways that is kind of worried all the time. You do want, you want exactly a little bit what Betsy
Yeah.
describes because that's how you, do you know what I'm saying?
Totally.
I think you do.
And honestly, it was the Super Tuesday swing, but sort of,
Yeah.
throughout, like,
Yeah, you
Trump
want
was
that.
far and away the juggernaut. Like, we had to get through Ron DeSantis and get through everybody
As we
else,
said,
and we
that's
did. But it was, it was,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great question.
yeah, no, very good question.
Go ahead.
I was really interested in, again, like everybody's saying, thank you guys for being here. It's really interesting. And I'm a history guy, so like I've been like reading all of these campaigns since like 1790, and I'm like looking at them and trying to,
Yeah.
right, a little bit different. But so I was really interested in not only the Sanders campaign in 2016, where he didn't immediately endorse Hillary Clinton, and then the same thing with Haley's campaign in like this year, where then she didn't immediately endorse Donald Trump until the RNC. What goes into endorsing the candidate? Because I know like your campaign was staunchly against Donald Trump being president and believe that Nikki Haley is the superior candidate. Like, why did that switch happen? I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, I can't speak to Sanders, I don't know if either of you guys can, but I think for us, when Nikki got out of the race, she again, like, made it clear what she was fighting for and why she ran. And also said, like, we've got millions of people who agree and, like, I hope that Donald Trump and his team reach out to them and brings people into the fold and kind of, brings us all together to move forward. And I think that, when she was asked, like, she's being pretty clear that she doesn't agree with Trump on everything. She ran because she thought that she would be the better candidate. It's funny, like, going back to Kamala Harris, like, we had to sign a pledge for the RNC debate saying that we would, support the eventual nominee to defeat President Joe Biden. In August of last year, Nikki scratched out Joe Biden on the pledge and wrote in Kamala Harris. Like, she always was like, we are gonna be running
Wow.
against Kamala Harris, like, that is where this is going. But, my point is, she was very much like, I don't agree with Trump on everything, but I agree with Biden and Harris on even less. And so this is the choice that we have. I am a conservative Republican. I ran because I thought that I would be the better candidate, but this is where we are. So I think that generally is kind of what, shakes out post-primary. But look, I mean, we have primaries for a reason. We have primaries because there are, divisions in different ways about getting towards that ultimate shared goal. This one was just a little wilder
Yeah, and
than usual.
I do think for this endorsement process, like, I don't want to speak for Bernie Sanders, but I think part of Sanders, he has some very specific policy and prioritizations that he wants to see reflected in the Democratic platform and in a candidate. And so part of him waiting, or not waiting, but taking a deliberate process before endorsing is partly to make sure, kind of, it's very akin to what Betsy's saying, this sort of, okay, I'm gonna lift up some of the stuff that I really care about. Will you agree with this? Like, how much is this gonna be part of your platform? Or not? And then making the calculation that in a binary choice, I'm going to align myself with this. But I do think you have a moment in a primary, sometimes you have a little leverage right? You got your little bucket of people and issues, and so you want to be careful with that. And so as you have a deliberate process about how you're going to do endorsements, like post-primary, or even in this truncated piece with the switch of the ticket with Harris, is to understand some of those people who have those issues to see how they show up.
Louisa,
Yeah, it's also, go ahead, Matt.
Go ahead, Matt.
I was just gonna say, one point, I actually think those last two questions in a lot of ways are tied together. Because smart front runner campaigns don't try to necessarily quiet down primaries. I mean, there's that impulse to want to, right? Like none of us like primary campaigns. No, they're not fun, they're brutal. It's mostly a personality contest because you tend to agree on a lot of policy. But the smart ones don't try to snuff it out because I remember to Betsy's point, I was asked on CNN the day after the New Hampshire primary, Ronna McDaniel says, the chair of the RNC says that Nikki Haley should step aside. Do you agree? And I thought back to a conversation I had with a voter in New Hampshire 3 days before who said, I'm going to vote for Nikki because even though I think Trump's going to win, I'll feel better when I have to vote for him in November. And it was like their ability to express, differences of opinion, disappointment, what have you, so that they could still understand they'll come around. And I think the power of an endorsement for a Nikki Haley or a Bernie Sanders comes in part because they kind of kept that campaign going. They weren't just this candidate that got a few 100,000 votes in some early states, but really became national figures. And it actually makes the weight of their endorsement when they come around to the nominee that much more powerful.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and the other part of it is, and I think this is true for Bernie, I think it's true for Nikki, I think this is true for Elizabeth Warren too. The people who like these candidates, who supported these candidates, who decide they want to be part of it, they put a lot of thought and energy and heart into it. They didn't just do it because of discipline, right? They didn't do it because they thought they were going to win necessarily. In fact, the odds were probably not great that Elizabeth Warren was going to win, or Bernie Sanders was going to turn into something in 2016, or Nikki Haley running against a former president. People felt like there's a principled position in a theory of the case for why they wanted to do it. So I think that for these leaders, they feel responsibility when they say, hey, it's time to get back in line. They really need to be able to demonstrate to the people who've sacrificed for them and volunteered for them, hey, here's why this is important, here's why we're doing this. We spent an entire year having this debate, and now it's time to get on board, and here's why, right? And sometimes it's policy, sometimes it's, sort of inclusion, sometimes it's something else, but it doesn't, you can't just turn it on and expect to follow it, your supporters to follow you. It's not that easy.
Yeah, that's a great point. They do think when you're on the road like that, especially for people who are retail and have been around for a long time, like these three people, that was very meaningful.
These primaries get tough.
And they get the people that have been with you, who's been with you. Okay, other questions, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Zach. Thank you guys so much for coming. So just observing this race, I've been sort of watching it every day, and I sort of notice unique things that are happening, at least to me, where I get like Instagram ads that are very targeted to me, and I probably see the Harris campaign's ads every single day on my Instagram feed. Like I see the Obama thing, like $5, and so I was wondering, in what ways is this election cycle, do you guys believe, setting sort of new precedent for campaign strategy, or what do you think is unique in particular about this election cycle?
I mean,
Yeah.
I'll start. I think that to what Roger said earlier, like the biggest mistake that I think campaigns make is say like, oh, well, like, this is what worked really well in 2020, or this is, I remember being like at the RNC in 2012 and it was like, oh, well, like this is what Obama did in 2008. It's like, if we moved on, like there's so much that's happened since then. And so every cycle is different. I do think that, to the slide that Louisa had earlier, like the media consumption has changed completely. Like, how many of you watch like cable TV?
You're watching on cable TV, you gotta fess up a little bit. Are you sports?
I mean, I try to tune into the news when I
Okay,
can.
nice.
But not on YouTube TV. Fair, but I mean, again, and this is a different demographic here, but I would say even when you look in surveys at media consumption, it's totally different. And so what we've done in the past in terms of like, this is what works for a media mix, is completely thrown out the window. So we have to adjust that. And I think I mean, the fact that you are getting Instagram ad all the time shows that like,
I'm gonna be like,
they're doing a good job, right?
Sorry, but yes.
No, it's fine. I think that was.
Yeah, but I also think that you know, there are so many more places that people are getting their news. Like, think about, like, the Trump team has done a very good job. Like, he's going on all of these podcasts. Like, not political, like the Joe Rogans, like sports related, like WWE, like it's a totally different ballgame that didn't exist before. And it's not necessarily that everyone's listening to those podcasts, but they're taking those clips and putting them on Instagram or TikTok or wherever else people are getting their news. So I think the media consumption has just completely changed and will continue to change. And it's incumbent upon campaigns to constantly be keeping up and not just saying like, oh, well, like, this is what people have done in the past.
Yeah, I'll be honest, yesterday, maybe it was today, there was a call Louisa and I were on, they were talking about the vice president's schedule. And they said, oh, and she's gonna be meeting with Cheeky Baby today. And I'm like, who's Cheeky Baby? And I started like, you guys seem like you know. I Googled
I
it.
had no idea.
I do
I'm just
know.
putting it out there.
Yeah.
Who's Cheeky Baby? Who's Cheeky
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay,
I
so
mean, you
yeah.
guys have an assignment. We're not gonna tell you.
Yeah.
Go look at your phones right now. It's Cheeky
Well,
Baby.
I couldn't even Google it because I couldn't spell right. You know?
Yeah, that's true too.
But, just piggybacking on that point, well, obviously, we talk about this fragmented media environment or fresh media environment. The platform certainly is something that's a defining feature of this campaign where we're, meeting people where they are. I think about my mom, for example, right? My mom's been in this country for 47 years. She's registered to vote, she votes all the time, but she's not getting her news from the New York Times, right? She's not watching CNN. She gets her news from Chinese language media, which is pretty traditional. A lot of it she actually gets from, a platform called WeChat, which Chinese Americans use to get, consume data, information rather. So that's one piece, the platform piece. I think the other piece of it, going back to the Cheeky Baby thing is, it's the messengers too, right? It used to be, we only ever saw another, senator, another politician, another elected official, maybe like a big actor, who hasn't been in a movie in 10 years, going out there talking about why you should elect this person. Now we're putting like influencers, right? It's the first time in a presidential cycle I've heard, we have an influencer, on the CNN tonight. We have an influencer pushing this. We had a whole influencer section at the convention, right? It was really, really cool. And again, it comes down to the idea, it's not just a message, but it's a messenger too.
I just think this is the thing. And the other thing I think about this, so like platform and the who, but the other thing is like, how do you figure out if it's effective? Like, so we've had ways of like, you can see viewership, right? And you can kind of see views in a very undynamic way on the internet. But I do think this is the other thing is like, we're all over the place. And yet we don't know, not sure yet of like what's working and what's not. And akin to that, I think what's gonna be interesting and that's new, and this may be more Harris, but I would think it's sort of like across the aisle too, is this idea of like how we're organizing. There is like a part of our world is still in a remote environment, right? So there's sort of like online organizing, particularly what we did in 2020. And then there's also a lot to be like.
I was gonna say, we're not going back.
Yeah, we're not
Which
going
is also
back.
a Kamala Harris slogan.
Yeah. So we're not going back. But then it's also this blended idea of like how we're reaching voters again. Like some of this has to be back in real life and then some of it still is online. And like, again, where's the efficacy in that and like where are we able to move the dial?
Louisa, I'm sorry, that's all right.
Go ahead, Matt.
I was just gonna say, because it tags into the point they were bringing, the biggest thing I've noticed that's different about this election, that is the reason both campaigns are doing those mediums, whether it's, Vice President Harris on TikTok or whether it's Donald Trump on podcasts, at least I feel like there's more engagement towards young voters with messages geared towards young voters than I remember seeing in a bipartisan way to try to engage them. I mean, I think if you go back before 2008, there was a belief that young voters didn't participate from 2008.
Or that you guys were unreliable. No offense.
Right, unreliable to show up.
Gonna get some unreliable, like find 65.
And I think because of the Obama era, young voters were largely going to vote Democrat. And what we're seeing now is actually a split, largely driven by gender, of young voters, with young men who are saying that they're more likely to support Trump, young women more likely to vote for Harris. And so both campaigns, and I don't know if I've seen a campaign like this, where you actually have both sides engaging younger voters through those mediums. I haven't seen that before.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, linear TV guy.
No, I just was wondering what wrench does all this
short form media throw in to the machine of spending on advertising, because it's so different than buying whatever TV slots, radio slots, or, you know, having to pay companies to get your ads on their website. It's just, you know, hiring people to put these videos on the internet. And I'm assuming, at least I'm assuming, that is a very different expenditure. So how does that work in the?
I think it's a good question. I'm gonna answer what I know, and then you guys probably know this much better. You are correct, like still your big anchor of your spending is like your big projected spending where you're doing, it's like TV and radio, right? Those kinds of footprints. That still exist, and you're doing targeting advertising. It may not be things you and I would see in Massachusetts or in Washington DC, but again, it's gonna be targeting ads you're doing in your battleground states. That being said, why the dollars may not be comparable, there is a significant amount of the budget that is all on this digital piece. It is both on the creation of it, the placement of it, and then also like the monitoring of it. So you, again, you're seeing who opens it, what do they do with your stuff online? But I don't know as a proportion, kind of like where it sits. Do you guys know?
I mean, I think it's different in every campaign. And I think that you have, you know, I would say on like the Harris and the Trump campaigns right now, it's very significant. And you're right, you do have, you know, like on a, even it used to be that you would have like your media consultant, like your guy who made the TV ads. That still exists, but now you have all these different people who are creating other content for you as well. There are people in-house, there are outside vendors, there are just sort of influencers and creators who make things that the campaign can use. And so like some of that is like staff infrastructure, some of that is like paying consultants and vendors, some of that's paying influencers. But I think that it kind of gets back to like, yes, some of that stuff is just put organically on social media, but most of that stuff has money behind it. And so that is a significant portion of the spend. And I think that that is continuing to grow. I mean, I don't know what percentage they're looking at this point, but like it's getting more and more significant.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a clear answer either, and I agree with everything Betsy said. You know, on Senator Warren's primary campaign, we didn't run any TV ads. And part of it was, again, you know, thinking about how we wanted to spend our time, how we spend our money. We didn't want to spend our money on broadcast or even cable. You know, we did primarily on digital. But there's no question that it's still, you know, the best way of reaching out to the most voters, right? It's just a matter of just like, is it actually effective dollar for dollar?
Yeah,
I don't know the
that's
answer for
what I
that,
was
you know, but in a world where you're actually raising enough money to do it, you know, I think it'd be malpractice to miss it, you know.
I have a quick question. You guys talked about viral moments and the hunt for viral moments on a campaign. As I look at Donald Trump's campaign now and in the past, he seems to have a lot of negative viral moments. And a lot of people say that there's no such thing as bad media, especially when it comes to Trump. Do you think that's a universal thing among candidates, that candidates could still benefit from a negative viral moment, or you think that's more of a Trump specific thing?
I mean, there is the old adage, right? Like all press is good press, right? So part of this is that idea. And I think it gets a little bit back to what, I think there's two things for Trump in particular. I'm using words that have a lot, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but sort of crazy Trump moments feel authentic because it is sort of baked in that Trump is unpredictable, is authentic all the time. So the question of kind of like how you understand it as a advantage or disadvantage for his campaign, I think he sees that and his team sees that as an advantage, right? No matter what the content is. So for him, any press is good press. And indeed, that is the way for his orientation. He came up in the 90s in New York City, right? Like being on the New York Post was like great. And it didn't really matter what that is. And so for him, sort of understanding his mindset is different. I do think, though, that Betsy has really sort of raised something where it raises the stakes for everybody. It raises the stakes of kind of like what the dialogue is like all the time. And I think that's hard, especially when we went back to the communication. You have to do contrast. And when you do contrast, sometimes you're gonna say like where you disagree and agree, and you want to be careful that it doesn't sort of just becomes a negative, sort of like a slog. So I don't think you have to go negative. I think like the campaigns, I don't think Obama was about hope and change, right? And there is clearly the momentum that Vice President Harris does. I mean, this idea of kind of some joy in all this has a very positive kind of, and she's used viral moments, like people sort of making fun a little bit of her about her laugh, right? And she's turned that on its head and be like, sort of like, why are you like such a downer about laughing? It's actually like sort of like a good thing in the world. So I do think there's kind of turning that head and having a positive moral. So I think it's just a point of opinion. I'm more of a consumer, less of a master of the arts of campaigning like these guys. And so I don't think you do. And I see we have his references of candidates who can succeed in that environment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know the answer to this anymore, but I think Bernie Sanders, I think Donald Trump also sort of defied the physics of what we all knew about sort of our media, what gets attention, how people react. I think about this past debate that the vice president had with Donald Trump. To me, hands down, I thought Kamala Harris won. She won on the substance, she won on composure, she won on communicating strong leadership, and the person that's gonna be the best president for all America. That said, several people who I think are pretty smart actually, mentioned to me, they said, what's the thing you remember most from that debate? Right? And it was almost all of it was about Donald Trump and eating cats and things I find to be pretty horrible. But the person was making the case that Donald Trump got a lot of attention for that and it was kind of viral, right? But the fact that that's what people remember from that debate drives the fact that he was talking about immigration in a way that resonated with his base, right? And it goes back to your question about sort of base or swing voters. He is really, really, really good at driving his message crystal clear in a way that doesn't seem obvious at first. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow, that's the big takeaway from that debate. It was about immigration. It was cats, but it was immigration, right? But then the other part of it is like, it just absolutely galvanizes base to a level that, we're seeing with their advertising. This is what they're talking about. They're raising money off of it.
That's a great point, Roger.
And I think that so much is exactly to that point. How the press portrays a moment is so often not how voters actually viewed it. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind as well, like particularly in like a Republican primary, like there would be moments when the press was like, oh my gosh, like this is so bad for Nikki Haley. And it's like, no, it's not actually, like, we're good. And so that disconnection, I think also is important, especially when it comes to Trump, because people are so like obsessive and want to kind of glom onto these like wild things that he says. And often voters are like, yeah, seems
bring
pretty
it.
bad.
Yeah.
All right, you guys, you know what? I just realized, because I'm enjoying myself so very much. It is 1:35 and you guys have to go on to your day. So I'm gonna say two things. One is there's more of this to come, so keep hanging out with us and all the stuff we're gonna be doing through the semester. Two, no matter where you come from this, please get engaged if you are so inclined. And there are a lot of ways to plug in and we'll do kind of the follow-up that we need to do if there's resources or things that you wanna think about getting engaged. And lastly, I just wanna thank Matt, who has like an awesome backdrop right there. I feel like it's sort of like an excellent New England office that you're in. And Betsy and Rogers, part of the things that is the most gratifying to me, having done some of this work for a really long time, is the people that you get connected with, new friends and old friends. And it's a really remarkable thing in this business that can have some really hard and yucky things. It's just some really just tremendous people that you get to work with. So I'm very, very lucky. Thank you for spending time with us. And everyone have a great day. Thanks for having me.
Much.
Down in, yeah.